Hello everyone. KTT contains one of the most versatile erosion solvers that exists today, and I want to take this video to explain every single feature that I've put into this solver and how it can help you create some of the most interesting erosion looks that you've seen yet. So on screen, I've got just a short sequence of some potential looks that you can get from it, and I want to explain to you a bit about how I've done that. So without further ado, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll enjoy. Real quick, fellas, if you guys want to follow along, you can grab KTT non-commercial for free from the link in the video description. Alright, let's get back to the video. Alright, folks, so before we go through each parameter individually, I want to give a very high-level overview of what the simulation is actually doing to compute the erosion. So this is a hydraulic erosion simulation, which means erosion due to water. And most of that water is rainwater. So in order to simulate the effects of rain, we essentially spawn a bunch of little imaginary particles on the terrain, and then for each particle, we move that particle down a little bit incrementally until we get like a full sort of path for that particle going downhill. And each time we move the particle a little bit, we take a little bit of sediment away from the terrain and then adds a little bit of the sediment that we previously took away back to that terrain. So we're essentially just moving the particle, taking a little bit of sediment or taking a little bit of material, adding a little bit of material back, and then we keep doing that and over until we get some interesting erosion. So with that context in mind, I think the following examination of each parameter will make a little bit more sense. All right, let's get to it. All right, so it's important to note that the subject of our examination here will be the KTT Smooth Fluvial Erosion node. This path trace light map node is mainly here for visualization because the shadows and such make it a little bit easier to see the details on the terrain. And we'll be going from left to right, top to bottom here. There's a lot of parameters to go through, so there'll be fairly brief explanation for each one, but definitely going to be try to be efficient about this. So let's start with this strength and duration section. So these parameters, as it says up here, are related to the sort of overall scale and intensity of the erosion. So for instance, this feature size is a good one to start out with because as I make this bigger, you can see the erosion gets stronger and stronger. But as I make this very small, you can see that the features that the erosion generates are very, very tiny, right? They're about as small as you can physically go for this pixels or this resolution of the terrain. But as I make it bigger, you can see like these channels and such keep growing and growing proportionally to the feature size. So I'm going to set this back at 8. Then let's move on to the erosion amount. So this is the overall number, or not, I mean, not the exact number, but this controls the amount of the those aforementioned sort of rainwater particles. So if we turn this down, we can see that the erosion gets very, very weak. And if we turn it up, it gets very, very strong. Now, also, please note how much longer it's taking to compute the erosion at larger values of this compared to at small values. Because when you increase this, it's spawning more and more particles. Each particle now has to compute, there's more and more particles to compute the erosion from. So the performance impact is directly proportional to the erosion amount here. And this next parameter here, this geological age, adds essentially an additional amount of erosion, like very large scale erosion, to simulate the effects of just really old terrain. It's rather performance light. It's kind of related to the erosion amount, but not really. The association there is a little bit complex, and I don't really want to get into that in this video. But you can see it's really making a much stronger effect on this. And if I increase the feature size, it gets even stronger and stronger. So that can add a little bit more oomph into your erosion, make it affect a landscape a lot more drastically. And yeah, And then this last bit is the erosion strength. So as it suggests, if I turn this all the way down, you can see the erosion's not really doing too much. But as I turn it up, you can see that's getting a lot more grainy, and now we've got some of these weird channels forming. So instead of being like the erosion amount, where this controls the number of particles, this controls the influence of each particle. So as I increase this, each particle can affect the terrain more and more, which leads to it being a little bit more unstable and a little bit grainier, but the erosion is stronger. And as I turn this way down, you can see the erosion's a lot weaker and it's a lot smoother. I personally find 0.5 is a fairly good middle ground. As you generally get more details, the grainier it is, but you don't want it to be like outwardly unstable. All right, moving on from that, we've got this erosion mask right here, and this requires a mask input for the terrain. So to give a brief overview of how to use it, I'm going to use a node called the Heightfield draw mask. And if I connect this up to the mountain, which is the node in the previous, just above the smooth fluvial erosion, and then I set the render flag on this, I can go into this handles mode, and I can just click and drag to draw a shape on here. And then if I plug this into smooth fluvial erosion, it's not going to do anything. But if we enable this erosion mask, we can see that suddenly the erosion seems to be more confined to this specific region that we drew here. But we can also see that there's some things happening outside of it, right? And basically, this erosion mask is not like a super precise, only affects material in this specific region type of thing. It's a mask on where the particles, the rainwater particles can spawn, right? So the erosive particles can only spawn in here, but because this is a slope and obviously they roll downhill, they can still kind of jump out of here and do erosion past that. But there's no particles spawning over here, so there's no erosion over there. Well, yeah, there's no particles spawning over here, and obviously there's no like way for the erosion to move upwards, right? So yeah. Anyways, you can change the field that you want to use for the erosion mask. Don't use the height, that's a little bit weird, but yeah, by default this is set to mask, but you can import a mask from previous nodes if you have one set up. Yeah, it's just pretty convenient. And then this remove field, what it does, and there are similar parameters like it on the other sort of masks that you can enable. Basically, it's if you're using a field that's not mask or height, it will automatically remove that field for you. And that just helps with organization and saves a little bit of memory, but you can turn it off if you want as well. All right, so I'm going to turn that off. And then let's move to the angle filtering. So these parameters relate to how the erosion interacts with different types of slopes. So by default, it's set to the wear angle is set to 0, the tailless angle is set to 0, and the max deposit angle is set to 45. So let's start with the wear angle. The wear angle is basically the minimum angle at which the erosive particles can spawn. So in this case, if I change this up, it's a little bit hard to see here, but if I keep going, we can see, pay attention to sort of what's happening on these slopes. They're getting less and less sort of eroded. That's because these slopes are too shallow for the erosive particles to spawn on, but the erosive particles can spawn on these steeper slopes. So this can be really helpful for, I'm going to sort of jump around here and change the rock softness up to 1, and then the channeling a little bit. This could be really helpful for I can't speak today. This could be really helpful for sort of creating, it's kind of like, it's another one of those masks almost, where certain details can kind of be masked to certain slopes. But in this case, you can see like the channels and such are only really forming on the steep bits. and they're creating this kind of harsher ridge between the shallow bits and the steeper bits, and this can be fairly desirable, and it can also really help you get a more diverse look to your erosion depending on the specific features of the terrain. So that can be really helpful. So I'm going to turn channeling back down to 0. I'm going to leave the rock softness at 1 for now. Or actually, no, I'm going to keep that back at the default. So that one might be a little bit hard to envision, but this next one will be a little bit easier. So tailless angle is essentially the angle at which the erosion is deemed sort of stable, so it won't erode like any further. So you can see that the erosion is kind of settling down to this gradient right here, instead of just creating the sort of like sweeping curve thing that you see here, right? So in this case, yeah, we could set this like minimum angle that the erosion can settle to. And this can be really helpful for a lot of things regarding like tailless cones and such. In fact, there are some examples in the handbook that relate to the creation of tailless cones using this erosion node. And for this next one, I'm going to set the rock softness back up to 1. And then I'm going to sort of change this, and it's going to be a little bit interesting. You're going to start noticing some stuff happening on the steeper slopes. So the key insight here is that sediment and like smooth or deposits they're only really stable to up to a certain point, right? And after that, they're like immediately going to fall off. So this kind of limits the formation of these smooth flows to a certain angle. So if I turn this all the way up, you can see that the texture of the terrain is very homogeneous. But in this case, I want these steeper bits to be a little bit more rocky, so I can change this and I can create, a more rocky look on those steep slopes and not have to worry about them getting like overly smoothed by the erosion. I'm going to set this back to 45 for now. But yeah, so that is the angle filtering, and let's move on to the rock. So you have already seen a little bit of like what rock softness does. Basically, rock is the sort of initial material that the terrain is assumed to have, right? And then the erosion cuts into that and leaves behind it very loose sediment, right? So if I turn this rock softness down, we can see that the erosion is having a rather difficult time eating into it. So a lot of the features from the original Heightfield are preserved. Let me just hide this. Right, it's a lot closer to the original Heightfield. But as I turn this up, we can see that the texture of these rocky bits starts to more closely mimic the texture of these smoother flows. And at 1, the rock is just kind of it meshes into the very loose sediment quite easily. And then you can also add a rock softness mask, which if I re-enable this draw mask right here, just to remind you where that was, you can see when I enable this, all the material surrounding the mask is like kind of infinitely hard, but the material in the mask is very, very soft, right? And this is multiplicative with this rock softness. So if I decrease this, if the rock softness parameter right here is like 0.3 and the rock softness value in here is 1, the rock softness in here will be 1 multiplied by 0.3. So the actual rock softness is like a combination of these if you're using the mask, right? But outside of this region, the rock softness is 0, so the erosion is not eating into the terrain whatsoever. And yeah, so this is another way to kind of mask the influence of the terrain. This one has a slightly different effect to the erosion mask, but it's fairly similar in effect. so I'm going to turn that off. This next bit, called sediment compaction, I'm going to turn the rock softness down a little bit. Basically what this does is you can see rather clearly the layers of loose sediment in here, right? How it's very smooth in contrast to these rocky bits, which are a lot more broken up. Sediment compaction will sort of compact some of that sediment into rock, right? So if I turn this up, we can see that the distinction between the sediment and the rock is pretty much gone. It's not quite in the same way as this, where I turn the rock softness all the way up. Even though when both of these are 1, or when rock softness is 1, sediment compaction doesn't really do much. But you could definitely see how these sort of textures kind of blend together, and there's not really much distinction between the looser sediment and the rock, right? So it kind of, yeah. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then this compaction threshold will sort of create a minimum, or it'll assume that there's like a minimum sort of depth at which that sediment can compact. So there's going to be a little bit of loose sediment, and then most of it would be compacted under it, right? So in this case, you can see there's a very little bit of loose sediment right here, but it's still nothing in like comparison to when there's no sediment compaction. All right. Anyways, you can play around with that. It's a pretty neat little effect, even though it's a bit niche. I'm going to turn the rock softness back up to 1 for this next demo. So now we're going to use, check this use bedrock feature here. And bedrock is honestly probably the most interesting bit of this whole erosion simulation, just because of how precise it is. So bedrock is essentially a layer of infinitely hard material, right? Essentially infinitely hard rock. It behaves very similarly to, but the difference is that this sort of exists under the initial like material layer of the Heightfield. So the erosion, if I just kind of change this, it'll kind of erode into the Heightfield as normal until it encounters the bedrock, and then the bedrock will just say, nope, no erosion for you today, and it'll just stick up through the erosion. So this is a really handy feature for crafting or like preserving details from the original Heightfield, right? So if I'm going to turn this off. If I sort of switch between these, you can see how the terrain details are transcribed exactly onto this eroded Heightfield. But now there's some sediment that's surrounding it, right? And I can increase the depth to sort of increase the amount of loose sediment that will form on top of it. Or I could decrease it to almost 0 or 0. And we can see it's just kind of doing nothing. But you can also turn on additive sediment, which instead of lowering the bedrock as you increase the bedrock depth, it'll instead raise the amount of sediment, right? So you can see this like it's kind of raising the terrain up, and that's keeping the bedrock in exactly the same position, right? So those little rocky bits are like literally the exact same. And this, as you can see, it's a really interesting way to sort of craft details and preserve them through the erosion, because the erosion sort of works its way around them in a very realistic way. If I change the grid spacing to be lower, which creates a higher res terrain, you'll see this a little bit more clearly. So the erosion's kind of flowing over these details, and then it kind of gets caught in these little crevices, and then it's like, or not, I don't know if it's a crevice, whatever, but it sort of gets stopped by this little ridge here, and then everything beyond that is just like the rock and such. It's really cool. I find this to be a significant step up from like the traditional way of doing it, or like traditional way of preserving details in the terrain, which is pretty much just like combine the eroded terrain with the uneroded terrain and just use like a maximum operator. So you're just taking the maximum height of both terrains. This is a much improved version of that, because the erosion actually responds to those terrain details in a very realistic manner. And yeah, and you can also use things like the bedrock map here. I'm going to turn additive sediment off for now, but if I'm going to blur this, I'm going to blur this a little bit. So just to remind you what we're looking at. Um, Actually, I won't blur it. Just cause I'm going to keep this at 4K right now. 4K as in the resolution of the terrain. And if I use this bedrock mask or bedrock map, we can see that the terrain is being eaten into a little bit. And that's because the bedrock is 0 everywhere where this mask is 0, and it's um 1.4 whatever meters deep wherever the mask is 1 right here. I'm gonna blur the mask a little bit just to kind of ease that transition. But if I increase the bedrock depth, you can see there's more and more. It like lowers it down a little bit, and there's sediment spawning like on top of here. And then there's nothing spawning, or yeah, there's no sediment over here to erode, so it's just not doing anything. Again, this is really handy for adding that level of precise control over your terrain's features, and I use this a ton. Right. Anyways, I'm going to go back to the lower resolution just so make it a little bit speedier. I'm going to turn off bedrock. I'm also going to set this back to 8. So that's it for the rock section. And let's move on to the channels and ridges. So if you've ever seen like mountain ranges, how they have the very deep channels and such instead of just kind of like being a bit of a blob like this is, this is where you can sort of create those features. So if I add channeling, the erosion will start creating these deeper channels, these little grooves into the terrain. And if I change the feature size, we can see those channels getting a lot bigger as well. And for this section, I'm going to keep the feature size fairly big, just so it's a little bit easier to see. And if I add more and more, you can see those channels getting deeper and deeper, right? And then what this channeling character does is it sort of changes the style of these channels from either being a couple very big channels to being many little small channels, right? So if I change it all the way down to 0, it's preferring creating these very small little channels over here, and a lot of them, right? If I increase that, you can see the intensity of them is getting a lot bigger. But if I change this back to 1, the channeling is creating just a couple very dense, or not very dense, very deep channels here. So I'm going to set this back to 0. And we're going to move on to sediment removal. So sediment removal kind of behaves in a rather similar way to channeling in that it creates deep grooves in the terrain. The difference, though, is that sediment removal prefers to create smaller, deeper grooves instead of channeling, which creates a lot of kind of uniformly deep grooves into the terrain that are like very big and such. And this gets highlighted a little bit more if I change the removal character, which works in a very similar manner to the channeling character. If I change this down, you can see how the sediment removal is only creating a few channels, but each of these channels is very, very deep. So this is, yeah, it creates, if you need like some very small, deep grooves in the terrain, but not too many of them, you want pretty much everything else to remain untouched. This is a good parameter to tune for that. And as I mentioned before, the removal character works in a similar way to the channeling character. All right, and then from here, we can see that we've moved on to this ridge settings folder. So suspended sediment is essentially a ridge sharpening type of deal. So you can see that it's still keeping our sort of sediment flows fairly smooth, but the actual ridges of the terrain itself are getting a lot sharper. So this takes a lot of the material from like it just really sharpens up these ridges essentially. I don't want to get too technical about it. All right, so moving on. We've got this ridge erosion here. So ridge erosion has a fairly complex uh, description, um, and you really don't need to mess with this at all. I just have settings here. I might move this to advanced in the future, but it won't really. You won't ever have to turn it off, I don't think. Basically, what can happen without it is at higher resolutions, the ridges of the terrain can get a little bit softer. And if I'm going to increase the resolution here just to demonstrate this. And turn ridge erosion off. This isn't perhaps the best use case or best demo of it. Maybe if I change the suspended sediment up a little bit. But we can see how the ridges on this terrain at this high resolution, they're still like sharp in like the general sense of the word. Like their shape is sharp, like their overall shape is sharp, but the actual specific details aren't that sharp. They're starting to get a little bit blobby almost. So ridge erosion will sort of correct for that, and it makes sure that the details stay consistent regardless of the detail of your terrain. And then moving on from the ridge erosion, we have the ridge softening amount. So essentially what this does is it biases the erosion to sort of eat away more at the ridges. So in this case, if I change like the channeling up, it creates this very smooth top effect, which is fairly interesting. There are many different use cases for this sort of thing. Or maybe you could just use it to kind of just tame the ridges on the terrain just a little bit. It can be useful to reduce the amount of noise on those ridges a little bit. But in this case, it's also, I really like using it for like this kind of, I don't even know what to call it, but like this, I guess, almost desert-y mountain type of look. It's got a pretty cool, pretty neat effect. Alrighty, so I'm gonna just move on to the flow properties, and I'm gonna just set the channeling to be about 0.2 here, just because that helps demonstrate some of the properties in here. So the first setting right here, the flow length, is essentially the length of the particle trail, or the length of the trail, or the length of the path that each particle follows. So if you remember, erosion amount was the number of particles that we are spawning on the terrain. The flow length is the sort of length that each particle's path that it rolls down. So if I turn this down a little bit, I'm going to have to turn the ridge erosion off just to kind of demonstrate this. If I turn this down a lot, we can see like the erosion's not really creating any like big features, but it's not behaving like the feature size necessarily. It's just sort of not doing a whole lot. Everything is very local to one region almost. But as I increase this, we can see the sort of channels getting bigger and bigger. And then comes a point where it's kind of diminishing returns. So I keep this at 256 usually, and that's the default. I rarely have to change it. And I'm going to move back to this ridge erosion right here. But yeah, that's sort of what it does. You won't have to play with it too much. So these next two parameters are friction parameters. So if I change this down, basically what this does is it allows a little bit of particles to, or it allows the particles to keep a little bit of their momentum. So in this case, kind of the effect that you'll see is that these channels right here will become a little bit more wavy. And if I change the resolution up a little bit, you'll see that a little bit more clearly. All right, you can see how they're they're a little bit wavier. Like the particles are running down here, but they kind of jump into this little wall over here a little bit, and they're like eating away at that a little bit more. As opposed to if I just set this to 1, where they just kind of directly fall down here and then just go straight downwards. But in this case, yeah, they keep a little bit of their momentum, so they create a lot more of an interesting channel. If I add in a flow lines node, you can see this a little bit more clearly. And I'm going to change the flow volume down just to kind of consolidate the flows a little bit. As I change this, you can see that the flow lines, they're like starting to be very wavy and such, right? Where they're kind of like bouncing off the walls. And this is really good for simulating like rivers and such. All right, so moving on to the rock friction. I've kept this at 1 because if I lower this down, I'm going to lower both of these down a decent bit. Rock friction, keeping it high will preserve a lot more details on like the ridges and stuff. But when we lower it, the entire terrain gets a little bit more. I don't know exactly what to call it, but the details on these ridges are a little bit less like precise almost. They're a little bit more streaky and such. So it can be useful in certain cases where it's like you don't necessarily want like really crisp details on these ridges. Hopefully you can kind of discern what I'm talking about, right? There's just a little bit more yeah, detail on these ridges, I guess you could say. It's a little bit hard to verbally describe what's going on. Maybe if I turn like the friction down quite a bit on both of these, it'll be a little bit easier to see. Yeah, so sediment friction alone will kind of, as you saw before, it'll sort of make the channels, keep them, make them a little bit more wavy and such, but preserve the sort of look of the ridges and such quite well. But if you turn both of these down, everything's going to kind of be uniformly a little bit smoother and such, as you can see here. So if that's the look that you want, yeah, that can help. But you'll need to change both of these down if you want to have it like be uniformly, I guess you could call it like slippery. I don't know what to call it. Anyways, flow volume. This is easiest to see when you have both sediment friction and rock friction set to 1, but it'll essentially expand the size of these channels, or yeah, like the little size of the channels at the bottom, right? So as you can see here at 0, let me just update. The bottom of these channels is very sharp, but as I increase this a little bit, it'll kind of expand and create like, I don't know what to call it exactly, but it'll, yeah, you can kind of see what it's doing. This can be interesting when combined with the sediment friction being a little bit lower. It can kind of create that like wavy effect that you saw earlier, but also the, yeah, expand the basin right here. So it might look like the rivers were kind of meandering a little bit, I guess. I don't know what to exactly call it. But it can be interesting for things like glacial erosion and such as well. Anyways, I'm going to set these back to 1. And the flow volume down to 0, I think. Yep. All right, so moving on. This velocity randomness is essentially a way to adjust the texture of the terrain. You can see it's created this a lot more like grainy but smoother kind of look on these slopes. And this could be really desirable if you have like a fairly chaotic terrain like that has a lot of wind or something. Creating these rather smoother shapes can really be useful for, yeah, a lot of different terrains. But in this case, it's a little bit grainy, so that's what this velocity randomness refinement is about. Basically, it'll sort of adjust the velocity randomness in some places to really smooth out the grain of the terrain while also keeping the base shape that the velocity randomness, like the smoothness of the overall shape, it'll keep that a lot more. Yeah, it'll preserve that, but it'll really kind of tone down the noise that you get from this velocity randomness. So that can be fairly useful. Yeah. just fiddling with that. But yeah, things like sandy slopes and stuff often benefit from this quite a bit because they're quite subject to like various winds and other things, so they don't necessarily form like really sharp features. But yeah, so that is the velocity randomness. So next we are going to move on to the granularity amount. So I'm going to turn the channeling down to 0. And yeah, anyways, so granularity. So essentially what this will do is it'll kind of inject like little pebbles and rocks and such into the flows of the terrain, as you can see here. So the more of this that you add, the more, yeah, it'll cover in those regions. Yeah, so you can see how they're kind of forming like that. I'm going to turn this down to about 0.1. But this is really good for just adding a little bit of texture. And this granularity scale will change the rough scale of the pebbles and such in there. So if I change this up to like 2 or something, uh, it'll create a lot more big pebbles and such. And if I change this down to like 0.2, all the pebbles will be very small. And this granularity strength is like kind of how intense these are. So if I change this up to like 10, they'll be a lot more spiky and such, right? Although it can kind of mimic adding more, like adding a slightly increasing the granularity amount and the granularity scale. But it generally, yeah, does change the intensity of these. So if I turn all the way down, they can be like almost invisible. But yeah, there's a sweet spot at like 0.4 or 0.5, I think, right? But yeah, you can see these are like not super intense. They're just kind of there, right? Anyways, yeah. So that is the granularity amount. And then finally, we have the uplift and outflow. So for this, I'm going to add in the handbook because there's an example in the handbook that makes this a lot more clear than this demo that I have here. So if I go to add the handbook, and if I go to workflows, examples, in the island example right here, I'd recommend giving this a look-see, just reading all through this. But basically, if I go to this draw mask, I'm going to zoom out, and I go to this right here. I draw it. You can see I'm creating this red mask right here. And then if I preview this smooth fluvial erosion, I go to the, oh, that's why. Sorry, I had my shading messed up because I was using the uh, path trace light map on the other one. I'm sorry, my voice is, by the way, it's messed up because I'm sick, so it's going to be a little bit rough for the rest of the video probably. But you can see that through creating this mask and then inverting it and then this smooth fluvial erosion, we've somehow created like this island thing right here. And that's all due to the uplift and outflow right here. So uplift essentially just raises the terrain a little bit each simulation step. So as you can see, like the terrain used to be right here, but now it's up, right? And I can increase this a lot more or a lot less depending on what I want. But this doesn't alone like do much. Like it's just kind of raising the terrain up. It's still flat. So that's where this outflow map comes in. Basically, outflow is just the material where the erosion, anything that gets deposited in there is just immediately swept out of the bounds of the terrain and removed. And in this case, that also includes the like uplifted terrain. So the erosion will, the erosion will lift up, or the uplift will lift up this bit of terrain right here and then erode it. And then all that erosion stuff just gets carried away by the outflow, and the seas That's what this is kind of mimicking. The sea is it doesn't get anything like eroded into it. It's just completely flat still. But everything on this little island here looks kind of eroded as normal. And yeah, and then this uplift mask or uplift map is essentially just a way of controlling the amount of uplift in different places. So in this case, if I instead of using the mask for the outflow map, if I instead used it for the uplift mask, you can see everywhere where the mask was 1, it's going to be uplifting the terrain. And then everywhere where the mask was 0, it's not going to be uplifting the terrain at all. If I, by the way, keep this, you can still see how the island is kind of forming, but the sea, or where the sea would otherwise be, is like not completely flat anymore. So it's not quite as precise as if I use the outflow map. Anyways, so there's also this outflow integration method, which is essentially just a way of it's can either do sharp or smooth. And it essentially just changes the look of the borders between the outflow regions and the non-outflow regions. I guess you could say so. When it's smooth, there's a lot more of a gradual sort of integration here. This is good for like really small rivers and such, where you don't want them to like, where you want them to, uh, like if you had like a mountain river here and you wanted to use that as an outflow, uh, you wouldn't want it to like be super, the terrain around it to be like super sharp. I guess this is really hard to explain. I guess the point is that it just smooth will be a little bit gentler. But sharp will be, yeah. Sometimes this is helpful for like bigger types of erosion and such. Um, yeah. So that's it for these 6 main erosion tabs right here. There's just one final thing left, which is the output tab. So if I go over here, so we see there's 2 tabs here. There's simulation and the output. And output is basically just how you control what type of data exits the simulation, right? Or gets fed to you from the simulation. So you can visualize an output, which will essentially copy one of the types of data to the mask field. So in this case, I'm copying the data on the deposits, which is essentially like the depth of these little these loose sediment regions. Or I could do where, which will give a map of all the regions where the terrain has been worn away. Or age, which is the sort of estimated age of the terrain, or age of the surface at any given point. So in this case, like a lot of these like flows, they are really like active regions, right? Like any sediment that comes from here is going to go down through here, right? So there's just a lot of motion going around there. But these ridges, they're a little bit calmer, right? Because stuff doesn't flow into them. And you could change like the age strength, which will essentially just change the strength of this map. Or yeah, the intensity of this map, because it's a very high dynamic range map. Like these peaks are a lot older than any of these, like the surface around these flow lines, right? So it could be helpful to just change the strength of the age depending on what exactly you want. Then the flows. This is a fairly similar situation. This is just tracking the motion or the particles that flow down the terrain. So every time a particle moves past a certain bit, that the flow map in that bit gets into what's the word? Gets changed a little bit. Yeah, it adds a little bit to the flow map in that region. So areas of high traffic will have higher values here in the flow map. And then the outflows, this is just, it's not creating anything new, and you won't see anything right here. It's just a very convenient way to pass through the data or pass through the outflow map from here, so that you don't need to do any extra work to kind of like reuse that or reference that from another node and whatnot. So if you just use an outflow map, you can just say visualize output outflows, and then it'll spit out the outflow map here. And then bedrock depth. This is the depth to the bedrock. In this case, we aren't using bedrock, so it's just gonna output 0. But if I check the use bedrock here, you can see that it's creating a mask from the difference in height between the terrain height and the height of the bedrock, right? Anyways, so that's the visualize output. So that will copy any fields to the mask if you need them. But there's also this output fields here, which you can use to output field or output data into its own field. So like if you want the deposits data or the age data and the flows data to be in their own fields, you can check those. And you'll see we have the deposits, age, and flows field showing up here in addition to the height and the mask. So I believe that is all of the parameters for this node. I really appreciate you watching. I hope that this was interesting to you and that this helps explain some of the perhaps confusing things about the smooth fluvial erosion node. I know it's a lot, but it's designed to be a lot so that you have the maximum amount of customizability and precision for whatever use case you want. So I hope this helped demystify a lot of that. KTT can be found in the link in the description below, as well as the KTT Discord. As always, you can check KTT out for free through the free non-commercial edition. And then if you have Houdini Indie or whatever, and you want to upgrade to the Houdini Indie limited commercial or the full commercial version for FX and Core, you can get that when you are ready. And if you enjoy the product. So anyways, thank you guys very much for watching. Yeah, I intend to make more of these videos on different nodes. This was certainly a hefty one to start out with, but yeah, I really hope that this was worth it. Thank you guys very much for watching. Bye.